Hello, everyone. Welcome to Literature Across Borders, a transnational exchange dedicated to young people's literature that myself, Megha, and my full co-founder, Dr. Alexia Casal, who is the course leader for the MA in Writing for Young People program at Spa University, founded at the university last year. Literature Across Borders pairs thematically related texts by authors in different countries, which are then read by students in the UK and in India to understand how authors in different cultural contexts are approaching similar themes. Our partners in India are Ashoka University and the Green Literature Festival. So today we're going to be looking at the third pair of books in season 2 of Literature Across Borders. It's a wonderful pair that looks at Robert Macfarlane's best-selling Robert Macfarlane and Jackie Morris's best-selling The Lost Words, and Vikram Seth's Beastly Tales from Here and There. These books are stunningly illustrated, compelling verse, and I'm so delighted to introduce the students who have read these books for the dialogue. Akshay Tahiliani is a second-year student of the MA English program at Ashoka University. He is interested in psychoanalytic studies and the representation of sports and fandom in literature and journalism. Clare McCarron is a student of the MA Writing for Young People program at Spa University, who is working on a contemporary novel in verse for young adults. Suzanne Faria is a child psychotherapist and a first-year part-time student of the MA Writing for Young People program at Spa University. She is loving the course, and the more she learns, the more passionate she feels about children's literature. And finally, the dialogue is going to be moderated by Nell Griffin, who graduated from the MA Writing for Young People program at Spa University and is currently continuing to work on the novel for young adults that she started when she was pursuing the course. So, Nell, the stage is all yours, and we can start the dialogue.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here. I hope you enjoyed reading the books as much as I did. So I thought we could just dive straight in and start with the first question, which is about if these books were your first time reading a novel in verse intended for young people, either from India or from the UK, and what that experience was sort of like. So if Suzanne, I come to you first, and then I'll go to Clare and Akshay.
Oh, well, it's not the first book I've read from English novelist, but I in the questions it doesn't say a verse book, so I actually that would be my first time reading a verse book from India. The novelist I particularly appreciate is Jasvinder Bilan, who writes a lot, sets her book as having been born in the Himalayas. But of course, that's a middle grade novel, not verse. I've read many verse novels from British writers, but that's the first one.
And so, Clare, if you're writing a book in verse, I imagine this sort of was a bit of inspiration for you. How did you find the reading experience?
It was great. The Indian books I've read before, or by Indian authors, were Jasvinder Bilan as well. I love Asha and the Spirit Bird and Archie and the Blue Gods. I love how she tackles bold and difficult subjects, oppression in Tibet, and she weaves mythology of Hindu gods with Scottish mythology as well in her Archie and the Blue Gods book. And her writing reminds me quite a lot of some of the impactful topics that are pursued in verse novels as well. And also Jess Butterworth, who's also spends summers in the Himalayas with her gran. I love her writing as well. And when I was researching for my own verse novel, I already came across Vikram Seth, because he wrote The Golden Gate. So one of the articles I read from my research was that that was sort of credited as paving the way for the resurgence of novels in verse in the UK, which had had a dip in the 20th century. I'm quite curious in India, if there was a dip in verse novels in India during the 20th century as well. So I wouldn't mind asking Ashke about that. And then when I came to reading Beastly Tales, I did absolutely love it. I do really love novels in verse, and I was delighted with the stories, blown away that they rhymed all the way through. My verse novel doesn't rhyme all the way through, and I thought it was extraordinary. I've been writing for the last year for my manuscript in verse, and I can't imagine laying on top of what I've already done, having to make it rhyme. And I read up on him, and it says that he does it for fun, which is an amazing thing. I liked the fun and the lightness of Beastly Tales. I felt transported back to childhood, where we were read a lot of Scottish poets like Liz Lockhead and Robert Burns, sort of, which is an extended narrative poem. So I don't know if that's where it seeped into my DNA. And at primary school, we'd have Burns competitions and stuff. And it's funny because I don't know how you guys are, but I find that I remember quite a lot of verse from my childhood, but I can't remember chunks of prose. So I think that's one of the strengths of verse novels. And also Aesop's Fables, I think, is really close to Beastly Tales. This is more like a modern version of Aesop's Fables. And I think children, I'm an ex-teacher, and I think children absolutely love fables and moral stories like this, because, you know, when I was teaching, they would come up and ask me 100 questions about the tortoise and the hare, because they know that there's another layer there and they're trying to dig underneath it. And I think young brains are really fascinated by trying to delve into the moral messages of the story. So anyway, I've probably talked enough now.
No, that's fantastic. That's so interesting. And what you say about remembering the sort of Aesop's Fables or that the verse from childhood is definitely true. And when I was reading Beastly Tales again, the tortoise and the hare is one of the ones that just sticks out to me. I remember it so vividly from childhood. So there's definitely something in that. So if I could come to Akshay now, how was your experience of reading these books?
So I also did, like Susan, ended up reading both the books. But to answer your question, I'm not too big on reading verse novels. And so there is, what I can remember is that there is a recent read that I had, which was by a writer from UK, was Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and I read her Aurora Lee, which is quite a long piece, and it really tested my patience on so many levels, because, like I said, I'm not too much into verse novels. But it's this story about, you know, a woman who aspires to be a writer, who wants to be a writer, and her coming of age as an artist, and how she sort of navigates through these various relationships in her life. And so I think when I was reading that novel, I realized that there can be so much fascination that can get generated when you're reading verse novels. So I think that was probably one of my longest reads in terms of a verse novel. So reading Lost Words was a very different experience, because I knew I did not need sustained attention span for this. While with verse novels, you do need sustained attention spans, and like Claire said, Beastly Tales rhymes till the very end. Aurora Lee at times maybe didn't rhyme. But again, with Lost Words, shorter poetry, it's easier to make them rhyme. Also, how, in particular, what I really enjoyed with Lost Words is that because Macfarlane and Morris are trying to give you a sense of the experience of each of these natural entities, right? They've stuck to the idea of making it as realistic as they can, be it with the way they use verbs in it, or they create an experience within the poem. I think what really stuck with me was the fact that, let's say they're writing about a chord, right? Each line begins with a letter of the word itself, which is a heuristic technique in terms of how we remember, let's say, numericals or so many other things that we want to remember, atlas, countries, and all that. So I think that made for a very different experience of approaching verse book, which was about wildlife, and experience as such. Yeah.
Definitely. I thought it was so interesting, actually, what you said there about the Lost Words perhaps being a bit easier to digest, a bit easier to read, and it's laid out really quite differently. And it leads into my next question, because I was wondering if any of you thought that the interplay of verse and illustrations, which we get especially in The Lost Words, but also a bit in Beastly Tales, whether it's important to have a lot of illustrations or drawings or things like that in books for young people, especially when they're talking about nature. So I think we'll go in the same order if everyone's happy with that. So if I ask Suzanne first, how she feels about that.
Well, yes, in both cases, I feel like the use of illustrations are really important and enhancing in books that are about the importance and preciousness of nature and wildlife. And yes, as you said, they're very different in comparison in terms of the illustrations, which in Lost Words is huge, sort of mouth-watering part of the book. But I thought the illustrations in Beastly Tales are also really enhancing, and they're lovely. They're so quirky. They also mirror the kind of quirkiness and the scrapes of the characters, their cheekiness, the kind of subversion as well of some of the tales. And they're very funny, which matches how much I enjoyed reading Beastly Tales and laughed aloud. And you can see that and I would have loved, I felt if a new production of this book could really do with a lot more of those illustrations sort of as well, breaking up some of the longer verses, especially the last tale, The Elephant in the Tragopan, that those illustrations are great, and more would also lend themselves to the verse and increase the kind of humour and enjoyment of the tales and underline the kind of morality messages of them as well. So yeah, I do feel illustrations, especially you thinking about the importance of looking after our natural environment because of the immersive experience as well as seeing, as well as words that enhance the images, and in Lost Words, how the images also enhance the words. There's kind of like a vivid interplay between both, which make that book so immersive.
Definitely some really good points there, and it's sort of interesting how the illustrations for both books sort of match the tone, don't they? It's much lighter in Beastly Tales, whereas The Lost Words, it's more mystical. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to point out. Thank you. And Claire, what did you think about in response to that question?
Oh yeah, I definitely think verse novels with illustrations are really important, especially when it comes to nature and wildlife. I think it's really good, especially thinking about Lost Words, for children to see the pictures, because they might not have encountered a lot of these plants and animals for themselves. And I think knowledge of nature in the natural world can be quite poor. So I live in a rural area, but even the children that I worked with, they're not great at being able to name the plants and animals that they're walking past in the morning on the way to school, or I suppose more it's becoming more common for them to be driven to school. So they can name cows, sheep and deer, which at least they can because they're in a rural area, because some city children haven't even seen a cow. And so I think the illustrations in Lost Words are really important because of disappearing nature. We've got things like elephant hawk moths around here and bee orchids, and it does sadden me that the children don't know what they are and can stomp across the common here on their way to school and stand on a bee orchid. I think some of our kind of cultural heritage is not getting handed on in the same ways it used to. So I think, especially in the Lost Words, because obviously the illustrations in Lost Words are outstanding, I think I used that book with guided reading when I was teaching, and the children would just pore over it for ages. Like after the guided reading session, they would want to get the book out again. And, like Ashke was saying, there's all these little hidden patterns and the way the letters are hidden across the page. It's just beautiful, and so much for the children to find. And I think as well, not just illustration, but you can get wordplay and imagery the imagery is woven through, like the elephant in the tragopan I was thinking about, where it talks about, the water distribution story, the last one in the book. I love there's a sentence about the big shot struggling with the flood was splashed with editorial mud, so Vikram Seth has used that lovely watery image all the way through that story. I think it's fantastic. And I think I should really talk about the illustrations in Beastly Tales as well. I think I can never say this word properly, anthropomorphosize the animals. They give them these human qualities which make them look relatable to children. I think they're vivid and funny. And I do think illustrations help children access books. And again, speaking as a teacher, I think where children are looking for shorter form, easier to read books, they've got reduced stamina at the moment, I think because of social media and COVID. So they are reaching more towards verse and graphic novels and manga rather than long form chapter books. And there is quite a big uptick in the UK in verse novels. And again, it'd be interesting to know from the Indian point of view if that's true. And these books are often accompanied by illustration and concrete poetry. So I think that's quite interesting. Sorry, I feel I've talked again too much.
No, fantastic points. And I get exactly what you mean, using the sort of illustrations to connect the language to real life things. So Akshay, how did you feel about that question?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what both of them said, but and just to put it together, I think what particularly this interplay of verse and illustration does for me in terms of children is it allows for sustained periods of curiosity, which maybe prose sometimes doesn't allow for. Also, because I think, look, rhythm and rhyme have a musicality of their own, right? So when you're speaking, and a lot of these verse narratives or verse poems or novels, whatever, they're spoken out loud in classes to allow more collective engagement, right? So, I think it promotes that kind of a collective learning first. Second, when you turn a page and you've already got a concept made in your head about something, to have the writers look at it, to have the writers view of that same thing and to see if it matches your imagination. uh, there's that kind of a play as well, right? With words, you're of course you're trying to be theatrical sometimes, you're trying to be playful sometimes, but when you have an image in your head and you turn the page and sometimes the image is the same, sometimes the image is different, there's some kind of a delight in that as well. And I think so this verse illustration interplay really works well with sustained curiosity, to sustain curiosity basically. And also one more thing I'm thinking is that, and this is something that used to happen back in my childhood when we were reading illustrated books, right? Um, Especially about wildlife that you can encounter in local regions. Let's say you turn a page or two and you see something and you've not come across it. Chances are that your curiosity might not be as piqued as somebody else who's seen the same thing. And for them to pitch in and be like, oh, I've come across something like that. Um, the kind of conversations that promotes in classroom setups, I think they are very enriching, and they have serious impact on how children develop towards perceiving environment through this collective learning. So I think that's something that both these books do really well in their own right. But yeah.
Definitely, I think those are some great points, and they do really encourage discussion, I think, these books. And even as I was going around and rereading them and people would see me reading them, they'd ask questions or they'd remember them, or certain tales that they'd read before. It really does encourage a conversation around it. So that's fantastic points. And I was going to ask what you thought about the age gap between these books. So Beastly Tales came out about 25 years before The Lost Words, and how you think how we talk about nature and the environment has changed, and if there was anything really noticeable in that sort of 2.5 decade gap. So Suzanne, if I come to you first and see what you think about that.
Well, yes. And actually, the thing that particularly struck me about Beastly Tales is that he doesn't balk at describing nature red in tooth and claw. So the one tale particularly, the beetle and the hare, the beetle and the eagle, as it's called, really, I just loved that first stanza that describes their lovely friendship and how all the lovely activities they do together. And then the next verse, the hare's head is ripped off by the eagle, and the beetle's thrown into this terrible grief that leads him into long-standing revenge. So that I did wonder, I thought, in today's market, how would that now be received? Because in Lost Worlds, certainly we see animals, and some of the illustrations show animals, who they catch, their prey, who they eat, but it's so much more gentle and sort of presenting us with the beauty of nature, with just showing that as a part of it, rather than the gory details. Which, I sort of thought, if I was a child, I mean, is it the two mice as well? One of those is swallowed by the snake and doesn't survive. But I know that's also very sort of subjective, because I know I always want everybody to be all right in the end. So that's a particular thing of mine. But having said that, another point actually about Beastly Tales, I sort of, and I think we've said it a bit when we were talking about illustrations, is that some of, especially Elephant and Tragopan, which has a very strong environmental message, it feels so current. But it's it's a really long poem, a really long verse piece, so that might be kind of broken up more, perhaps with illustrations, or not to miss the central point and to keep attention spans.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it shows how sort of embedded we are in our sort of current reading, that we can read something only from not even 30 years ago. And even I was a bit shocked. I was like, oh God, tell me he's going to be all right in the end, and then he's not. So yeah, I think that's definitely a big difference that I noticed as well. Fantastic. Claire, how did you feel about that question?
Yeah, I do agree with what Suzanne has said as well. And also I think, I suppose, thinking about our attitudes, I think a lot has changed in the last decades in our acknowledgement and our admittance or our acceptance of our climate troubles. We know more, I think, about what we've done, or at least we're admitting it. I mean, I did a botany degree years and years ago, and we were already talking about environmental disaster, climate change, etc., etc. So we knew about it then, and there were lots of people like me and lots of others shouting in our tiny voices, but it just seems to have taken an awful long time to gain traction. And also, I was thinking about the animals in Beastly Tales and in The Lost Words, about how many are now even more endangered than they were 25 years ago. So I'm thinking about eagles here and nightingales here, and I don't know if that's the case in India as well. And also elephants in the wild. You know, how many habitats have been lost for all of these creatures across the world? How often did children see them compared with 25 years ago? And also thinking again about this water redistribution in the Elephant and the Tragopan tale. It's interesting that even 25 years ago, there was fight over land and water distribution was such a huge theme that appeared in this story, and the selfishness of man's actions and obliviousness to nature and habitats. There's so much more awareness now. And there's a bit I'm going to read later, Vikram Seth's plea at the end. I hope Suzanne's not going to read the same bit. It's quite heartbreaking to read now. We didn't do the right things 25 years ago about building dams, taking water from animals, certainly in the UK. And I think about lots of countries across the world. And also the UK has done an awful lot of damage in other countries across the world. We are culpable for a lot of it. And despite our destruction, we seem reluctant to pour our energies into fixing what we've broken. And I think these books are important because we have to teach children that you cannot, like the UK has done in so many countries, just pull the ladder up and let communities living on or near the equator or disappearing island communities burn or drown, because we are culpable and we're one of the perpetrators. And when I was teaching, we talk about it a lot now in teaching. You know, children are real little eco-warriors, and we taught about fast fashion, and children were very shocked to learn that the Aral Sea on the border of Kazakhstan was drained to make cotton, to make jeans, which we wear in the UK. And when they made that association, they were quite shocked and were thinking they weren't going to buy any more jeans, you know. And we teach them loads of stuff like regenerative agriculture and things like that. But all this stuff is old knowledge. And we're teaching it as though, like regenerative agriculture, which could fix so many problems, we're teaching it as though it's new. But I think that's why, as you can probably tell, I'm very passionate about environmental education, environmental books, and getting the message to children in a way that they can access and want to do something about. You know, they like reading through the point of view of animals. They're more likely to empathise with an animal than another human.
That's fantastic. And yeah, maybe it's a question more about how the world has or hasn't changed in the past 2.5 decades rather than the books. But those are some fantastic points. Akshay, how did you feel about that question?
Yeah, Nell. So I think when I read The Lost Words and when I was, let's say, 2/3 done with the Beastly Tales, I realized one thing, that the way we can look at these two different texts 25 years apart is the beastly in the Beastly Tales is central to that narrative, and the lost in the Lost Words seems central to that particular narrative. Because and I think Claire mentioned this earlier in our conversation, that the Beastly Tales has an anthropomorphic narrative to it. You have all, so when a child is reading, and when even I am reading at 24 these stories, right, I'm thinking about, there is some kind of a diplomacy involved here. If I'm looking at a child growing up, I want the child to understand maybe that the backbencher maybe is not the best guy to be with, or stuff like that, right? Because there is, I mean, what was that story about the eagle, and it beheads the hare, right? The eagle could be anyone, the hare could be anyone, and we often typify people and compare them to certain animals, their characteristics to some certain animals that we see daily, and that we learn from these kind of narratives, right? That an eagle has a certain characteristic. So human being who's having a certain similar ways of behaving comes to be, nicknamed as an eagle or whatever. A brave person is often called a lion, and so on and so forth. So I thought the Beastly Tales was trying to teach people more about how the nature can help people learn about the human version of themselves, or how they can educate themselves more about how the human society functions itself. The Lost Words, I thought, was an ode to a lost cause, in a sense, right? That these are things that have, because when words are lost, you realize experiences are lost as well. Articulation of experiences is lost as well. So when I have a word to articulate an experience, it allows me to acknowledge the fact that I have been in a certain environment, received a certain stimuli, acted and responded to it a certain way. And so over the course of 25 years, I think that is what has changed. We're not looking at we're not looking at the environment as a mirror to sort of animate our own movements, behaviors, or what we can project out there, but we're just trying to come to terms with a natural frequency of nature, how these things exist in their own sort of uh, natural way of going about. I was remembered of this really nice poem in The Lost Word about the newt, and the newt is a cute creature, is what The Lost Words begins with. But there's a dialogue quality to this as well. And the newt says, "Well, I'm not cute. Although I am minute, I have my own ways of being about. I am quirky, and I can be aggressive as well." Not that he's being aggressive in the poem, but we're letting the newt decide what newt wants to be, in some ways, right? And I think that kind of sensibility is what I really enjoyed as I moved between the two texts. Yeah.
No, there's some fantastic points there, and yeah, maybe that's what's, or one of the things that shifted over the years, that we're looking less into ourselves and more out, and what we've done and our own environment, and maybe how we can change that. Really, really interesting points. Not any that I'd thought of myself, and all of you have got such different insights to them, so that's just fantastic. So I thought I could move on to the next question, which is just about how well you think readers in your part of the world would respond to these books and whether or not they'd enjoy them. So, Suzanne, how did you find that question?
Well, I really enjoyed how instantly recognisable the creatures are in Beastly Tales as their figures. I mean, from the front cover onwards, we've got Cat and the Fiddle from childhood nursery rhymes, Aesop's Fable, so they're already familiar. And I was just delighted to see them presented with so much fun and lightheartedness. And yeah, I thought the characters were enhanced, and in some of the stories kind of shed new light on them. And I did really enjoy the anthropomorphism of the animals. Yes, I had more to say actually about the Cat and the Fiddle, because I really enjoyed in the original nursery rhyme, I couldn't remember a cockerel. So I really loved the presentation of their relationship and how his cat-like persistence is really shown throughout that story. So I thought the stories would be very relatable actually to today's children, and they would really enjoy the quirky humour. There's so much of that in the book, like the greed of the goat and the ram is so enjoyable. I can just see how much children would enjoy that. And also the morals that he presents are really meaningful and make you think. So I felt in these tales there's so much discussion that could be opened up with children and young people. What's their take on how these particular creatures responded to their challenges, or did they win out actually? That I love the hair as the kind of media magnet, because that felt very current actually today, social media, and how the tortoise had actually won this, slow plodding. It sort of enhances that morality side, and I think could really elicit a lot of interesting, fun and informed thought about how do we respond to the challenges in our lives, what's the characters that help and support us.
Definitely, that's a great point. And I think I remember so much from assemblies and things like that in school, that to get a sort of moral or a story across, they would tell a story, and it would so often be centered around animals, because if it's people, for some reason we can't connect to it as well, whereas when we're children, something about animals makes it so much easier to relate to. So I completely understand. That's a great point. Claire, how did you feel about this question? What did you think?
Yeah, I think both books are very relatable. I think the messages are universal. Beastly Tales would work really well as an older offering, I think, for upper primary school children, sort of 7 to 11-year-olds. They're a lot of fun, and I think they get the message across in a really non-preachy way through the perspective of animals, which children love, like I said before, sometimes better than humans. And I think also for less experienced readers who maybe read below their age-related expectations, they're good, again, helped by the fun illustrations. And I think, I'm thinking about the mosquito and the louse story. It's such a great lesson that if you let something talk you into something and take advantage, the consequences can be catastrophic, because the mosquito causes the death of the lice and all the family who'd lived there through generations. There's a huge jumping off point to talk about some, PSHE, the personal, social and health education side of the curriculum with children, to start big, important discussions. And you could go through each of these stories, and the moral in each of them would be a great and funny way to get into some quite hefty topics. I think children at the moment need a lot of hilarity in their lives, because we've been back from COVID a few years, but they experienced and saw so much that they shouldn't have. And a lot of children around the world are experiencing a lot that they shouldn't have. Sorry about the noise coming from outside. And I just think it's good to have a funny way in to topics like this, that it's necessary to discuss them, and discussing them in animal related way, I think it means it's more accessible, because we talked about brutality earlier. You can kind of get away with it because it's a lice and a mosquito. So
yeah, fantastic. I mean, the tone of a book can do so much just to bring up those topics, and like you say, it's maybe a gentler step into some of the really important things that children need to discuss. Fantastic. So Akshay, how did you feel about that question? Do you think readers in your part of the world would relate well to these books?
Yeah, I think I've got levels to answering this question, and the first thing that I thought when I read The Lost Words and when it came to me was, I am somebody who's always looking forward to expanding my sense of environment in terms of places I've never visited. So A, I was delighted, but B, I was also taken aback by the fact that there must be lost words in my own language, because I'm not like a native English speaker, right? I speak Hindi, but I also speak Sindhi, so I'm a multilingual person, and Sindhi is spoken even by much less of the population in India, right? And then there's so many languages that coexist in India and change through even the most slightest of distance traveled between the state in the same state, right? So there's clearly, when I look at the lost words and what the cause that it's trying to address in a nation like India, I think it really explodes. I think the fact that its importance explodes, its significance explodes, because there's so much that gets lost now when most people are looking at English as something that provides an upward mobility and becomes must when you want to get jobs or see yourself as a global citizen, for that matter, and allows you to connect people. Like, I'm here because I can speak English and I was able to go through all of this and have the ability to articulate myself. But when it comes to translating this work, or when it comes to looking at, let's say, local work, I think the cause that the lost word addresses in post-colonial nations, or in nations where language sort of, varies a lot, has a lot more significance in terms of reviving those languages, reviving some words that get lost, reviving experiences. Um, and the other way that I had, and the other thought that I had with the question is that how I feel there are ways in which the lost words are not yet lost, and I'm sticking to the context of the book that I have, The Lost Words, and this word, let's say the magpie, right? I did not know that the magpie was a bird until a few years back, when I started, uh, until let's say 2015, when I started watching English football and realized that there's a team called Newcastle United, which they like to call themselves the Magpies, right? And that's how I came to know that, well, maybe magpies are uh, more found in regions around Newcastle, or stuff like that. So I think when I'm looking at the lost words and pushing forward or promoting that cause that the lost words gets behind, I think sports teams nicknaming themselves after these birds, or general narratives like those, general initiatives like those, an organization nicknaming itself like this, a popular organization known across the world, is what I mean. Be it sports, or be it marketing, or anything like that. Them getting behind these words and these local sort of essences which are getting lost can be really helpful in terms of promoting these lost words, lost experiences, and stuff like that, and can then make things more enjoyable for readers across the world. So yeah.
That's such an interesting point. I never thought about that. That, yeah, maybe other people, if that's the only context they learn a word in, that's so interesting. I think I've got a few examples of things like that when or American sports teams and how they got there. Anyway, that's besides the point. But yeah, it would be really interesting to see if other countries across the world can, well, due to the success of the lost words, can have their own version of their own lost words in their country. So I actually live in Wales now, and I grew up here, and their school system is just so fixed on making sure everyone knows at least a bit of the Welsh language so it doesn't die out, because it's so important to the culture. So yeah, excellent points there, everyone. So I thought I'd move on to the next question, which is about how these books can appeal to young readers as well as adults, and whether or not they lend themselves to be read together with parents or caregivers, or I think Claire mentioned you used to read it in schools as well. So whether books in verse lend themselves to being read aloud more easily. So if I come to you first, Suzanne.
Well, I absolutely felt both books completely lend themselves to being read aloud. When I was reading Lost Words, I read them aloud, and it helped me slow down, and really made me appreciate the kind of the sound beats and the images, and how much with reading aloud slows that process down, and if you're sharing it, even more so, bringing the animals, the plants, the birds into much more kind of vivid life, and just it's so satisfying. So definitely a book to share with readers, young or old. Lost Words, I felt. And so I also read a lot of the Beastly Tales aloud, not the whole book, quite long. And I started to feel I want to hear this as an audiobook or on the radio, because as you read it aloud, the dialogue springs into life, and you could just hear somebody, finding different voices for the characters. And it really makes sense of the verse, in a way, if that makes sense. When you read the sections of Beastly Tales aloud, they just absolutely fit. I mean, the skill of the rhyming in those stories is just breathtaking, I thought. So I'd absolutely love to be read Beastly Tales as a listener. And just, yeah. And also, it does feel like something traditional about fables and morality tales. They're meant to be read aloud. So, yeah, definitely.
No, definitely. That idea of an audiobook, that would be fantastic if we can get someone with a really lovely voice to read both of the books, actually. They're very different in tone, but they'd be fantastic. And I've actually got a young niece, and as I was reading both of them, I thought, oh God, I'd like to read these with her. I feel like that'd be a really fun experience. Fantastic. So Claire, what did you think about for that question?
Yeah, I completely agree with Suzanne. I think, verse novels are so accessible to being read together, read aloud. Children, like in primary schools, there's a lot of learning sections to perform and illustrate. So there's a really good poetry competition that runs every year in the UK that's quite big, called the Clipper Poetry Award. And children shadow 5 poets. They choose one of the books that's right for their phase, learn poems, and then you submit your poetry performances to the competition, and so it shadows the competition that the poets are having as well. It's absolutely fantastic, because you're getting verse novels that have just been published by Joseph Coelho, Michael Rosen, some really Carl Nova, some really top poets. And children absolutely love it. We usually do it in the summer term, and they'll learn the poems outside, perform them, and they find it easy to do. So even the readers that struggle the most in classes are able to learn poetry, because they can learn it like a rap, and they get the rhythm, and it is a really successful thing. And also, when you read a verse novel to a class, you can read it in a few days. Whereas when you read aloud a prose novel, which we tend to do at the end of the day, it can take weeks to get through a year 5-6 prose novel. If you were reading a Jasbinder Bilan one, that would take you a good 4 or 5 weeks to read aloud for 20 minutes at the end of the day. I totally agree with Suzanne about it being great for audio. And interestingly, I came across quite an interesting uptick when I was doing my article for the publishing module on this course, that there's a massive uptick in song lyric consumption by 8 to 18-year-olds in the UK that's been in the last sort of 3 or 4 years. And this is according to the National Literacy Trust. So I think it is a really good idea to get quality verse novels read by really good people, alongside where children are accessing their audio, their songs. So on Audible, Spotify, Amazon Music, I think it would be great to get more verse novels up there. You know, because they're written in a way, I think, that gets the message across in a really kind of spare, trimmed down way, which are great for less experienced readers. What I liked in year 6 was children could walk around with quite a chunky book. It looked like quite a chunky book. Like, I mean, I've got piles and piles of verse novels. So, you know, they can walk about with a book like that. So that book is probably only around 30,000 words. It's written in verse, whereas I think, what would it be, 70,000 words if it wasn't in verse. So children, you know, in terms of the self-esteem, if they're not such good readers, they can have a book like that, but the text is less dense. The illustrations are still there, but they're seen as more cool. And then I think, as we talked about before, the layout and concrete poems, etc., can be a real draw. They love poring over concrete poems, like in Crossing the Line by Tia Fisher. She's got the most remarkable concrete poem of the boy's been trapped in a locker by some other boys that have bullied him. And it's a figure bent over, trapped in the locker. And it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary book. I completely recommend it. The children can read a book like this in a short time, but they're still accessing quality literature. And in Beastly Tales, I really like how Vikram Seth, he doesn't overwhelm, but he doesn't dumb down the language. So he's using words like omnipresent, egregious. So there are enough words like that there that the children will ask, what does that mean? But they don't have to stop every few lines to say, what does it not mean? Because that would really take the heat out of it. And then I think teen anger is a big thing. And I think verse novels, quite a lot of the early ones, like from Jason Reynolds and Elizabeth Acevedo, you know, they've come from a place, social agenda issues place. But there are also signs, and which is a good starting point. And Sarah Crossan writes a lot of social agenda, Manjeet Man, you know, there are loads now. But also there are signs that our verse novel consumption is widening. So Tia Fisher, who was on our course last year, she suggested that if middle grade verse novels were taught in primary schools, I'm just reading a quote from hers, at primary level, children might be more inclined to continue reading after Key Stage 2. But I think, and she's frustrated at how few there are, but I think hope is coming, certainly in the UK, at how many middle grade verse novels have started to make a big noise, like The Final Year by Matt Goodfellow has been massive here. Kathy Faulkner's Digging for Victory, and Nadine Asher-Jassett's The Hidden Story of S.D. Noor's just come out as well, which is next on my reading list. And I think it is important. I think, you know, obviously I've been studying it for a year, but I think verse novels can be life-changing. I wish, so I'm writing an own voice one, and I'm writing it for the 16, 17-year-old. I wish I had had that when I was 16, 17-year-old, because I needed a book like that, didn't have it. I think they help reluctant and lapsed readers to engage. I think they can be powerful in tackling challenging issues that affect young people's lives. I think the emotional power of a verse novel can be really significant. I think something like Beastly Tales, you've got the short chapter, you know, it helps with current shorter attention spans as well, because there is an awful lot of competition for young people's attention. I think the less words on the white space encourages readers. It's good for ADHD and dyslexic readers. And yeah, and also, like I think I mentioned, they utilise figurative devices in a really engaging way so that children can access difficult concepts, whatever level they're reading at. And a final quote this is from Lucy Cuthie, who's my tutor. So she said, the fact that Taylor Swift can put out a 15-minute song and people enjoy it goes to show that it's not just about concentration span, it's about immersion, which I think's very wise.
That is a fantastic quote. And yeah, I completely see all of your points there. There's something sort of less intimidating about a verse book, even, you know, as a writer or reader in their mid-20s, when I pick up a book and it's in verse, you think, oh yeah, I can read a bit more now. Whereas if you pick up sort of a chunky prose book, you think, oh, I don't have time, I'll come back to that later. That's fantastic. And the idea about putting verse books read as audiobooks on Spotify or things like that, I think is $1 million idea. So someone's going to do that soon. Akshay, how did you feel about this question?
I think Susan and Claire covered most ground. Like, I don't have a lot new to add to that debate, but I think I certainly agree with everything that's been said, because personally, I feel like in India, where, again, or any multilingual background, right? In any multilingual culture, when you're going through, so I'm not just thinking about English, but I'm thinking how one can sort of, be, because a multilingual subject is always thinking about, or not, if not always, sometime is aware of the fact that in pursuit of one good language, another language that they may know gets lost, or sort of is subdued, right? And I think this particular idea of really sort of engaging and immersing, that's the word Claire used, immersing yourself and engaging with material in any language in a verse mode, sort of helps you to kind of move over that subdued nature of one language over the other. I generally think that people do believe that once you've learned a couple of languages, learning a third language is very different. But now I wonder what changes would it make if, let's say, I at 24 were to learn Spanish through the verses in Spanish, right? Because even when people learn new languages, they often have this system of learning languages the way the tests, whatever A1, A2 level, or whatever these kind of language tests are designed for, right? So I think I'm looking at this kind of a debate from that generativity as well. How is it? I think it's definitely going to be more beneficial to encounter new languages first in verses, and then maybe in prose when children want to learn those languages, or when adults want to learn those languages as well. And it'll be interesting to see if there could be a study about that, how that impacts, two sets of groups. Maybe one takes over prose modality of learning a language, and the other one goes through verse modality, and how that impacts. So yeah.
That's such an interesting idea, to learn sort of the language around, rather than, what you're taught, like, this is my name, this is where I went, blah, 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 and actually learning about the lost words of the language. I think that's a fantastic idea. And sort of going off of that note, does anyone have any books about nature or the environment that they would like to recommend to anyone here or anyone watching, and why? So, Suzanne, I'll start with you again.
Yes, well, but the book that immediately sprang to mind was Wilding by Isabella Tree, which is a very beautiful, breathtaking book that helps to show even the small things that we can do can help nature. And it's about a rewilding project in West Sussex, somewhere called the Knepp Estate. And I think the really hopeful kind of core of that, it shows how nature can heal herself if let be. So yeah, and it's a very beautiful book. I totally recommend it. I've also got a book called The Green Man by Belle Mooney and Helen Cann, which is quite a short, kind of like a picture book, but it's got plenty of words. It's not a kind of younger age picture book, kind of middle reader, and it's about a boy called Luke who notices all his world is grey. He lives in a block of flats. Everything is urban. Dad's behind grey newspapers. There's cars, vans, buses everywhere. When suddenly he passes a tree and he sees the green man, who's kind of a Celtic image, a very natural image. He's a face of a man with leaves sprouting from his mouth and all from him. And then after that, he starts to see the green man, like he sees him in the cabbage that Mum's bought. And he springs up everywhere, and it then encourages him to start to find nature in his own life. he dreams of it. It's got this lovely kind of mythical undertow, but it also, a bit like Wilding, has a message that you can start your own garden, even if it's small, even if it's a window box. He meets this rather magical elderly woman who has an allotment, and he starts to learn about the plants, and it's the Green Man that's led him there. And it's the most lovely book. It's quite old, actually. I think it's 1997 it was published. So quite an old book. And also, I hope this isn't cheating, because this is a book called Belonging by Jeannie Baker, who was born in England, but actually lives in Australia, so she's sort of English Australian. And this is a second book, actually, and it doesn't have words at all, only images, and in each image you just see, it's hard to show online. It starts off and you see a very urban town, and it charts the birth of a new baby, and it's all in pictures or the odd kind of image. There's a little card that says new baby, congratulations, but it charts this child's life in images, looking through the same window till she goes to school, primary, secondary, graduates. Finally, she's back home with her, married, and then she's back home with her own new baby. And by the final picture, you've seen this town, the images which slowly grow while people have started gardens, they've grown plants, the kind of some of the old B&B smash repairs is now a kind of little public park. And it's absolutely a beautifully stunning book that I just stumbled upon in the library at Bath Spa in the picture book section. And just finally to add, it's actually a second book, because she wrote a first book called Window, which goes the other way, and that's really it gives the opposite as you look through the window through the protagonist's life. It starts with the beautiful green rural environment that's gradually built over. So I was very glad that she wrote a second book. But they kind of belong together. But they also, which I like about the Green Man and also Wilding, they're very hopeful, and they give you the ideas of what even if it's small, the small things you can do to help support and protect our environment, which I think is so important, because in our current climate crisis, it's very easy to feel absolutely powerless, and especially for children and young people, the future visions can be very bleak. So feeling empowered to take small steps in ways that bring you kind of satisfaction, joy, and nourishment, I'm really keen on that.
Oh, fantastic. Can you give us the titles again? So what was it? Wilding by Ella Tree, Belonging by Jeannie, which is Geannie Baker. So again, that's a book without words, but tells it all through images. And The Green Man by Belle Mooney. Brilliant. Thank you so much. They sound like some fabulous recommendations. Yeah. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Claire, did you have any books that you wanted to recommend?
Yeah, and I thought that was lovely what you said, Suzanne, about being hopeful as well, because I do sometimes worry that we stress children out with what we're handing over to them, which seems very unfair. So yeah, mine's also hopeful. So the first one I've got is a non-fiction book. It's also written by Robert Macfarlane and Jackie Morris, and it says on the back, "This is a book of spells to be spoken aloud. Here you will find conjurings and charms, spells that protect and spells that protest, tongue twisters, blessing, lullabies and psalms." And one of the poems, for example, is just called Moth, and the poem starts off beautifully and then gives the names of various moths as well. And it made me think about, we used to do a long drive from quite far up in Scotland, all the way down to England in the summer. And on our car, so many insects would be dead. So on the drive, we'd have to keep stopping to clean the windscreen because there are a lot of hedgerows along the sides of the roads. Now, when we drive up and down to Scotland, you never have to stop and clean your windscreen. And it does slightly terrify me because where have the hedgerows gone? Where have all these insects gone? You know, it is scary. But the book is beautiful and hopeful and does a similar job to The Lost Words. It's really gorgeous. I used to use that in school quite a lot as well. And then I also, I can't find it. I think I might have left it in school. It's called I Am the Seed That Grew the Tree by Nicola Davis. And again, it's poems about nature and just, you know, take children through lots of bits of lost nature they might not otherwise encounter. There's another gorgeous book called, it's a picture book, but it's aimed at slightly older children, so maybe 7+, called The Tin Forest. And it starts off about a man living basically in a forest of tin, like a scrap heap, and then starts to build beautiful things out of it. And then nature creeps back into this forest of waste. And then fiction-wise, I was thinking The Rescue of Ravenswood by Natasha Farron is really good, about the fight for a woodland habitat. It's a really good fiction read, but again, it's got a nature theme. And I think, I mean, I've got quite a few, but I think the other one I really like is Nora's Ark, which is quite new, by Victoria Williamson. And it's about a little girl who comes from very challenging home circumstances. You know, they're having to go to food banks, which is becoming more and more prevalent here. And yet she spends all her time, even though she's not got enough for herself and they're really struggling, and where she lives, it hasn't really got what she needs to sustain her. She rescues wildlife. She spends all her time trying to rescue wildlife and look after them. And it's a really gorgeous story. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. Could you just give us a list of the titles just to make sure everyone's watching and get them?
So The Lost Spells, then I Am the Seed That Grew the Tree, The Rescue of Ravenswood, and Nora's Ark. So it's not Noah, it's Nora's Ark. And The Tin Forest. Sorry, that was the other one.
Fantastic, thank you. I think The Lost Spells has to be next on my reading list, actually, considering what we've just read. Fantastic, thanks, Claire. Akshay, did you have any recommendations?
Yeah, first of all, thank you both of you for those recommendations. I was looking to go book shopping soon. I think I have a list now. I do have a book that I think would be, it makes an important sort of juncture when you read environmental literature as such, right? And I think it's important because places we inhabit, we often get used to looking at those places a certain way, and sometimes we need to be jarred. We need to be, shaken and told that maybe there's something else out there, but we're so used to looking at the outdoors in a way that there shouldn't be any cognitive dissonance as such, with what we're trying to perceive. And so we only stick to one way of looking at an environment. And the book I'm talking about is by this Bombay poet, Arun Kolatkar, and it's called the Kala Ghoda Poems. And I would like to give a shout out to my batchmate Farishta, who was a part of the Literature Across Borders initiative last year. And she wrote a great thesis on this book as well this year in our postgrad program. And so the Kala Ghoda Poems is basically about this space of the city, Bombay, and there's a locality there called the Kala Ghoda. The Kala Ghoda translates to the Black Horse. And these are poems that imagine and rather reimagine sort of this space through eyes of through eyes which are used to looking at, let's say, the beautiful aesthetics of Bombay, but are now inquiring, is Bombay really beautiful? Is the places do I look at? Is there really all that is to say about those places, right? So he meddles with this idea of looking out there to a Bombay which is just beautiful. But what about the dirty Bombay, the Bombay that we sideline, right? The Bombay that, let's say, the Indian cinema on most occasions won't show you, right? Or any cinema wouldn't like to show you. The glorified London that no cinema would like to show you, sort of, uh, you know. And he looks at these characters that, let's say, a drug pusher, a beggar who's sort of there on the street, but no artist would go to them or see their sort of routine and derive a poetry out of it. But what would it mean to sort of place them in this locality of Bombay and imagine an aesthetic of the city that includes them, and the way they utilize a space, that the way that they inhabit a space, and does the space then remain the same for us? Those are the questions that come out of that reading of mine, and I think that's one good book that I think people should read, because it really pushes you into an introspective kind of a reading of the places you inhabit yourself. So
Fantastic. Can we just get the title and the author again?
Arun Kolatkar. The title is Kala Ghoda Poems. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Oh, so many wonderful recommendations coming in. And I thought just before we wrap up, I could ask everyone or invite you rather, to read any of your favourite passages from the books we've discussed. So if I come to you first, Suzanne, if you've got any favourite parts you'd like to read out and explain why.
Yes, I picked out a couple of pieces from Beastly Tales. I actually concentrated on the pieces that I just really enjoyed, the humour, the lightheartedness, and in the first case, the trickery of it. And the first piece I've chosen comes from The Rat and the Ox, which is a verse which explains how come the rat ended up first on the Chinese zodiac. And I will read how he did it. I'm picking up from when the ox was going to be first. He's much bigger than the rat, and that's why he would be first. And the rat comes up with a plan. Then the rat feigned gloom and grief one night, creeping like a thief, snivelling to the ox he came, and he wept. I'll die of shame. How can I face public scorn? Oh, why was I ever born? Look at my pathetic figure. If I were a little bigger, just a little bigger, I would not wish to shrink and die. I know you deserve first place. Save me from my just disgrace. Now the ox felt rather sad. Rat, don't feel so bad. Even if your size were doubled, I would still be quite untroubled. You don't mind? Not in the least. I am much the bigger beast. Ask the godling for permission. I will second your petition. Well, I'll do as you have bid, said the smirking rat, and did. Soon he'd grown to twice his size, from his ankles to his eyes, and on the appointed day, ox and rat went on their way, wandering jointly through the town. Women threw their baskets down, screaming, "Oh my God, that rat! Nothing quite as big as that have I seen, or ever will. Just to see it makes me ill." Nonetheless, they crowded round, and a shocked and rattled sound emanated from the horde, while the ox was quite ignored. Though they wandered side by side, everywhere the people cried, "What a beast! How huge! How massive!" Then the ox, so far impassive, thought the people had gone blind, or that he had lost his mind. "Am I all that small?" he said to the dog, who shook his head. "No, I wouldn't say you're small, or the tiger, not at all, or the horse, or sheep, or pig. But that rat, he's really big." That is how the ox lost pace, sinking down to second place in the zodiac, while the worst beast of all is still the first.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. That's fantastic. I loved that one. So, Claire, could I move on to you? Do you have a favourite passage of yours that you wanted to read out?
Yes, I'm torn because I've got a few favourite passages, but I'm just going to with this is the elephant one at the end, the story at the end, where the water has been taken off all the animals and the elephant is fighting back. So he's gone to see the mayor of the town, the big shot. The elephant first sipped his tea, then ate a biscuit leisurely, then shook his head from side to side, and having cleared his trunk, replied, "Well, even as regards supply, I do not see the reason why you do not use what lies to hand before you try to dam our land. Even my short walk through this town shows me how everything's run down. During your long administration, your pipes cry out for renovation. Your storage tanks corrode and leak. The valves are loose, the water's weak. I've seen the water gushing out from every reservoir and spout. Repair them. It'll cost far less than driving us to homelessness by blasting tunnels through our hills and bloating your construction bills. But that's just one of many things. Plant trees, revive your wells and springs, guide from your roofs the monsoon rain into great tanks to use again, reduce your runoff and your waste, rather than with unholy haste destroying beauty which, once gone, the world will never look upon." The elephant, now overcome with deep emotion, brushed a crumb of chocolate biscuit off his brow. "Dear chap," the big shot said, "somehow I think you fail to comprehend what really matters in the end. The operative word is votes, and next to that comes rupee notes." And I wanted to read that bit because it's quite topical for us in the UK with our elections approaching. And I just wanted to leave you as well. So Vikram Seth leaves us with the morals at the end of the book. So he calls it his quasi-morals. Here are two. The first is that you never know just when your luck may break, and so you may as well work for your cause, even without overt applause. You might, in time, achieve your ends. The second is that you'll find friends in the most unexpected places, hidden among unfriendly faces. For small fry swim in every pond, even in the doldrums of despond. And so I'll end the story here. What is to come is still unclear, whether the fates will smile or frown, and Bingo Vale survive or drown. I do not know. I cannot say. Indeed, perhaps I never may. I hope, of course, the beasts we've met will save their hidden valley yet. The resolution of their plight is for the world, not me to write. And it's quite scary because he wrote that 25 years ago, 25 plus years ago. So, yes.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Claire. And yeah, as you say, almost scarily poignant right now. So both those sections are fantastic. Thank you so much. And finally, Akshay, did you have anything that you wanted to read out? Any particularly favourite sections?
I think the Lost Words is full of these small little verses which are so nice. Like you can read them out anytime and they'll make you happy, and then you have a picture alongside to sort of accompany you in that delight. But I'm looking at one verse I'm looking at basically two verses which I felt really impacted me, and one of them actually, the adder, right? He writes about the snake, the adder, and it hit me hard because I was playing cricket the other day in a ground and I realized I heard a sound, and for a moment, the first thought I had was, is there an adder around? I didn't realize, but that rhymed. So I'll just begin with the adder. It says, a hank of rope in the late hot sun, a curl of bark, a 6 and 8, for adder is as adder basks. Deep in heather, coiled in gorse, sunk among the winter stones, for adder is as adder hides. Darts, diamond slides, sine wave swerves, live wire curves of force. For adder is as adder glides. Echo of snake, self-escape, a left behind ghost. For adder is as adder sheds. Rustle of grass, sudden sussels, what the eye misses. For adder is as adder hisses. So that's the adder, and I kid you not, I heard a hissing voice and I was like, whoa, an adder in India? What's happening? Uh, and then this next bit I have is about the lark, which is, as the poem describes it, a very small bird. But I really liked it because I realized when children read a verse like this, and we were talking about how a lot of this literature sort of impacts readers. They feel sympathetic towards, let's say, animals, and through animals, maybe towards other people. I thought this might help somebody realize about their sadness, and to help them in a difficult time like that when they're not feeling great. Uh, is a massive achievement for a verse like this. So here goes the lark. Little astronaut, where have you gone? And how is your song still tormenting on? Aren't you short of breath as you climb higher? Up there in the thin air, with your magical song still tumbling on? Right now I need you, for my sadness has come again and my heart grows flatter. So I'm coming to find you by following your song. Keeping on into deep space, past dying stars and exploding suns, to where at last, little astronaut, you sing your heart out at all dark matter. Yeah, that'll be it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Such lovely sections in all of the books. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for all of you for reading the books, for really thinking about all of your answers and discussions for these questions, because there's so many interesting points that have come out of this. And yeah, for just taking part to facilitate these discussions around nature and the environment and young people's role in it. So yes, I just wanted to say thank you so much. Really enjoyed talking to all of you. It's been fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yes,
same here.
thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks for
much.
having us.